Hey guys, it's your host Rashida Punawala, and welcome back to the nationally ranked award-winning podcast, Career Spotlight. Today with us we have Mr. Anthony Scaramucci. Mr. Scaramucci has done it all, from Wall Street to the White House, to being an author and podcaster, to an entrepreneur. So much to talk about, so let's get started. So today I have with us Mr. Scaramucci. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to coming on the podcast.
It's really good to be here. Thank you for having me.
So my first question is, you've had an amazing journey so far. So tell us about your childhood and kind of your growing up years.
So I grew up not too far from you. Obviously, I live in the town of Manhasset now, but I grew up in Port Washington, which was right by if you're familiar with Port Washington, I grew up behind the Landmark on Main Street. Now, that was my elementary school growing up. And so I was born in 1964, and I went to elementary school there until 1976. And then I went to the Weber Junior High School, which you may be familiar with. And then I went to the Paul D. Schreiber High School in Port Washington. So my first 18 years of my life were in Port Washington. And my uncle had a very famous motorcycle shop, probably closed down about 25 years ago, but from 1953 to the year 2000, my family members owned a motorcycle shop in Port Washington, and I worked there as a kid. And then I went to Tufts University out of high school, and then from Tufts University, I went to Harvard Law School.
Okay, so I know that you're big into finance, and you started a company called Skybridge Capital. Do you mind talking to us about that and how you started Skybridge?
Yep. So I started Skybridge Capital at the age of 41. I was just maybe a couple of seconds of my career prior to that. So I went to work at Goldman Sachs right out of law school. I spent 7 years at Goldman Sachs. And then I left Goldman Sachs to start a business. I was successful with that business. We sold it.
Okay.
And then once I got that business sold, a few years after that, I started Skybridge in 2005. And so Skybridge is 19 years old. It was 19 on March 7th.
And, congratulations.
Thank you. And we have about $3 billion under management, and it's in a diversity of different asset management products. And so I've spent the last 19 years of my career working at Skybridge. And we also own at Skybridge something called the SALT Conference, which is sort of a thought leadership think tank. And we do that conference around the world. We've done it in Abu Dhabi, in the United Arab Emirates. We've done it in Tokyo, Japan, Singapore, in the city of Singapore. We've done it in Las Vegas, and we've also done it in New York City.
What made you want to start Skybridge?
Well, a couple of different reasons. I always wanted to have my own business. And so when I started my first business, let me step back for a second. My goals were always to have my own business. And so I wrote down in my diary, if I could pay off my student debt, I would then start my first business. And it took me about 7 years to pay off my student debt. So I graduated in 1989. I had the debt paid off by 1996. And so I left Goldman Sachs to start my first company. And then when I sold my first company to a successful asset management company, it was a great company to work for, but I wanted to create another business, because what happens to you is when you go into entrepreneurship, you sort of want to stay as an entrepreneur. And so that was the impetus for starting it. And then, of course, what happens when you start a business, you have to make some changes and adjustments depending on the markets. And so most recently, we've made some adjustments where we've gone into the cryptocurrency space. But by and large, we've been in more traditional assets.
Actually, talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, so recently Bitcoin and crypto prices have gone up. So can you talk to us about Bitcoin and crypto and where you see that going in the next 6 to 8 months?
Well, to be general about this, to really understand this part of finance, you have to do a lot of homework. But there's something called a blockchain, And basically over the blockchain, I can transfer value, or I can transfer something from myself to you, and you can transfer it back to me without permission. And so typically in our world, over the last 5,000 years, we've used banks, or we've used a third party intermediary to help us transfer things back and forth between each other. And the blockchain basically allows us to have that transfer done without that permission. And so it's a fully distributed ledger, and it's checked off by hundreds of thousands of nodes to verify the transactions. And so when you think about this, it is almost like a decentralized bank or a decentralized spreadsheet. And this is a very valuable thing. And so there was a man, we believe it was a man, probably a woman or a man, or maybe a group of people by the name of Satoshi Nakamoto, about 16 years ago, created this cryptograph called Bitcoin. And he put it out on the web, and he made it decentralized, and he explained that we could use this token, if you will, to exchange value between each other. And he said that if this caught on, or people felt good about it, it would rise in value, and it would offer a medium of exchange without third parties. And so we've had ups and downs over the time that he's started this thing known as Bitcoin. But the asset has done very well over the last 14 years. And we believe, because of the network effects associated with it, meaning maybe there's 80 million Bitcoin wallets in the world right now, there'll eventually be 800 million wallets, and possibly a couple of billion wallets. And so as that scales, because of the scarcity of Bitcoin, there's only 21 million of these coins, it'll probably push the price up.
Okay.
And so we made a big investment in this in 2020. Mm-hmm. And of course, there are other cryptocurrencies besides Bitcoin. And, some of them have great use cases. And some of them, frankly, are just meme coins, which are tokens that people are trading or gambling with. But some of the other tokens that we think have real value would be Ethereum, Solana, something like that, something like Avalanche. These are companies that have these other tokens. They act like layer one tokens, where you can add a second layer or a smart contract on them. And so for me, we're very excited about the long-term trends in this industry. And then just the last thing I'll say, which I think is also relevant, is that the United States this year, in the beginning of January, approved a Bitcoin spot ETF, meaning they're allowing people now to buy Bitcoin and put it in their brokerage accounts. And so for this reason, this is also improving the activity in Bitcoin and the price appreciation.
Okay. That's interesting, because I know, in 2020, there's a lot of talk about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, and now it's resurfacing. So, yeah. Okay. Moving forward, you recently wrote a book called From Wall Street to the White House and Back. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I've written a couple of books. I wanted to write a book about, I went to work for Donald Trump in the White House in 2017. After 11 days, I was very famously fired by the Trump administration. And so there was a lot of infamy associated with that. And then I returned to Skybridge and went back to work. And over the last 7 years, I've collected a little bit of wisdom and a lot of different stories. And I thought it might be beneficial to share those stories with people about how to be resilient. So even though I had a really bad failure at the White House that resulted in me getting fired after a short period of time, I was able to go back to Wall Street and continue my career. And I think it's a big lesson for younger people that you can't be worried about short-term success or failure. You have to keep going, and you have to stay optimistic, and you have to not worry about the thoughts of others, and just focus on yourself and your family. And I think that's the resonating messages of the book.
if you don't mind me asking, what is something that you learned about yourself and maybe just even about the way the world works when you were at the White House?
A really good question. So, unfortunately, when you go to a place like the White House, you get to learn a lot of information about the world that may not be in the newspaper or may not be in cable news or on your social media feed. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of dangerous people in the world. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's people in the world that, whatever their political or personal grievances are, they want to hurt innocent people. And so we have to rely on the resources and the skill of our government uh, to help us and to protect us. And so what I've learned, frankly, is that there's a lot of very, very good people in government and that I'm proud to call my friends. And there's a lot of people around the world that work for the United States that are really just working very hard to avoid terrorist attacks. And so this because you live in this town.
Yeah.
Many people, unfortunately, died in this town. Friends of mine, because I was living in this town when it happened, died on 9/11. And so I know it's almost 23 years ago, but those memories for us that lived here and the people that we lost on that day will never be forgotten. And so we have successfully, by and large, prevented other large-scale terrorist attacks in the United States, knock on wood, and I hope we'll continue to do that. But the world is dangerous, and there's a lot of very smart, hardworking people that are trying to keep all of us safe.
So moving forward, you recently were on a show called Special Forces, which is kind of taking a turn from what you do in finance. So can you talk about that? Why did you want to go on the show, and what was your experience like?
So the show I went on was a knockoff on a British show about the SAS, which is like the Special Forces of Great Britain. They brought the show to the United States and put it on Fox, the network, which is Channel 5 in our local area. And so they asked some people that were high profile if they wanted to be on the show to see if they could handle the extreme conditions that our troops are put in. And so I had a grandfather and uncles, and my dad were in the U.S. Army. And so I never was in the U.S. Army. And so when I was offered the opportunity, I thought, okay, I wonder if I'm tough enough to do some of the things that, you know, that we could, you know, I had to jump out of a back dive out of a helicopter. They set me on fire, and I
Oh,
ran out of a house, and I had to roll on the ground and see if I could put myself out of fire. They sunk me in a car with a seatbelt on. I had to hold my breath
oh.
and see if I could time my exit from the car by holding my breath. And I don't know. I thought I wanted to try it, and I ended up being on the show with the Met Hall of Famer Mike Piazza,
Okay.
and I was on the show with Danny Amendola, who won 2 Super Bowls, and it was a lot of fun for me. It was a great life experience. I'm very happy that I did it.
What is something that you took away from doing the show Special Forces?
Well, I think the number one thing that I took away is I was in a controlled condition where, they were trying to make sure that we were safe.
Mhm.
But I just want you to imagine our men and women in the armed forces that are put in these uncontrolled positions where they're actually risking their lives to make sure that we're free, or risking their lives to make sure that we're safe. And so for me, I think that's the biggest thing I learned.
So now to my favorite part. You have your own podcast called Open Book. Can you tell us a little bit about why you started that podcast and, yeah, just why you started the podcast?
Um, you know, the number one reason is the interest. You know, my podcast, probably like your podcast, you want to meet
Yeah.
interesting people, you want to talk about great ideas, and you want to share it with other people. And so my podcast is about authors. And so I have books that get sent to me. And here's one of them as an example, or look at this
Okay.
one here. And this is called The Wizard of the Kremlin. This one is called The Mortal Secrets of the modernism. It's like Freud and stuff.
Yeah.
And so I often tell people that you can read a book, and in 10 hours of reading, you can get 10 years of life experience. And so I want to read the books from people who put those life experiences together, basically.
Now, through all these different roles that you've been in, from being on a show to being in finance, being at the White House, what are some of the challenges that you faced, and how did you balance everything that you were doing at those times?
You're asking really, really good questions. And so
Thank you.
the truth of the matter is that you sometimes are out of balance. Sometimes you can't keep the balance in life. And so you probably know this from when you're studying, let's say for the SATs,
Yeah.
you may have the test coming up. And so you decide that week prior to the test, all you're going to do is focus on the SATs. So your life is out of balance temporarily, or maybe you're going to audition for something, or maybe you're going to try out for a sports team. And so what I have found in my life that I don't really sometimes keep balance, I have a series of periods of time where things are out of balance. So as an example, when I was writing the book From Wall Street to the White House and Back, I maybe dedicated, 4 straight weeks where I sat in front of a computer and typed and did research and worked with my editor and passed the information back and forth with my editor to get something done. And so I'd like to be in balance, but sometimes to be super successful, you can't be in too much balance. You have to sometimes work harder than the average person to make things work.
Well, I agree with that. Like, you do really have to work hard for the things that you want to do and achieve. So now I just have one final question. What is one piece of advice you would like to give to our listeners?
I think if you don't mind, I actually have 3 things I would like to say. So
yeah, of course.
The first thing I would say, in the age of social media, we can sometimes focus on what other people are thinking or saying about us. And so social media has a tendency sometimes to be cruel and unkind, and you have a lot of anonymity in social media where you could get these anonymous people saying mean things to you, and they can sometimes be very hurtful. And I think it's very, very important in the current time that we're living in is to do your best to ignore those comments, that maybe your mom told you this or your grandmother told you this. What other people think of you is none of your business. And if you practice that, I think what ends up happening is you can live more successfully just ignoring the noise. Second thing I would tell you is that life doesn't have to be perfect. If you read my life story, it went up, it went down, it went up, it went down. But as long as you're making progress, as long as you're happy every day with the journey you're on, it can be very, very rewarding. And you don't have to be overly worried as long as you're trying your hardest. And I guess the third thing is that don't fear failure. As a young person, I wish I could talk to myself. So I'm 60 now. And so that means I was 17, 43 years ago. I wish I could go back and talk to the younger version of me and say, hey, don't be fearful. There's a lot ahead of you, and be brave. And even if you fail at something, you'll be able to pick yourself up and pull yourself together and keep going. I think these are big, big resonating messages for people.
Well, that's all the questions I have. Once again, thank you, Mr. Scaramucci, for coming on the podcast. That's all we have for today. I'm your host, Rashida Punwala, signing off.